Namaste and welcome to Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste, Narad.
From the record of yoga, Sraddhalu will speak on direct and divine knowledge.
Thank you. In the section of the record of yoga that we have been studying, the third Chatushtaya, we saw consists of 4 things. Jnanam, which is the divine knowledge. Trikala Drishti, the vision of the 3 times. Ashtasiddhi, which is the 8 siddhis, which also we looked at in some detail. And Samadhi, as the state of deep immersion in which we have access to all ranges of consciousness without limits. So these being the 4 facets of this third aspect of the integral yoga, we have covered the last 3, and we come to the first. In fact, the first should be, in priority, the first. But because it is something so comprehensive, so complete, but also in many ways so much beyond the range of human experience, we found it helpful to first get an exploration of the things which are accessible to us, the 8 siddhis, then the whole thing, idea of samadhi. From there, Trikala Drishti, already you saw, going beyond the superficial appearance of what the vision of time is. If we enter the supramental time sense, it takes us into a domain which is so beautiful and yet so beyond our reach in direct experience. Presently, let's put it that way. It's important to put these qualifiers. So we come now to the Jnanam, which is the supramental consciousness, of which all these things become inevitable outcomes. In the practice of the integral yoga, this whole Chatushtaya is of the supermind, Vijnana, but it is not as if you're supposed to enter the supermind immediately and directly. The movement towards the supermind is what this describes. But you begin the movement where you are. From this, there is an intermediate poise, which Sri Aurobindo refers to as the intuitive mind, and perhaps further intermediate gradations. And through the intuitive mind, one begins to enter the supermind, and even there are further gradations. In particular, and I hope to cover this over 2 or 3 sessions, in particular, he describes how the current working of our human intelligence is like a reflected and a reduced representative of the supramental consciousness. So from this intelligence, we would as if open to a greater working, which would be of the intuitive intelligence. And that's not yet the supermind. It's a ray of the supermind, so to say, from which we would open to the supermind intelligence. And when we have that, we will discover that itself has a higher grade of functioning, which is its more true intelligence. And so that becomes an intermediate point, which leads us to that higher and truer form of the intelligence of supermind, which itself is a kind of a narrowed focus of the full free working of supermind, which is the fullness of it. So distinct stages, each of which is accessible from its previous stage, is the series through which we ascend to that consciousness. The whole thing is made very much accessible, tangible, experiential, and practicable so that we can reach it. Let's first understand what it's all about, and then we will go through each of these steps and see how it can be realized. The description of Vijnana, the Jnanam, the first point of the 4, is given in 2 sections, which I have put links for, In the first one, which I will reach, it is somewhat complex and cryptic because there is an attempt to describe its higher working with insufficient elaboration. So all the right words are there, but without a background, you can get a bit confused. The second description, of which we will read, is much more practically oriented. And then from there, we will go to the full elaboration of this, which is in the synthesis of yoga. There is absolutely no difference between what is in the record of yoga and the synthesis of yoga, except that in the synthesis of yoga, the whole thing has been fully developed, elaborated in all fine detail and minuteness of nuance and variation and stages of practical ascent and experience. That's the only difference. Conceptually, there is no fundamental difference. So I'm insisting on this point because there are those who want to speculate and thereby confuse Sri Aurobindo's teaching by saying there are differences, and they want to as if distort and exaggerate an idea of a difference for purpose of mischief. That's a theme we might touch upon later. But so we come to Vijnana, and Vijnanam, which is consisting of these four: Jnanam, Trikal Drishti, 8 Siddhis, and Samadhi. So what is Jnanam? What is this supermind, knowledge, consciousness? By Jnana is meant that power of direct and divine knowledge which works independently of the intellect and senses, or uses them only as subordinate assistants. So here's a very simple first explanation. Power of direct and divine knowledge. This power is not dependent on your intellect. It works completely independently. This is important to know. Why? If it was dependent on the intellect, the two would be somehow inextricably bound. When it works independently, that power can actually be working in us subliminally or superconsciously, and we wouldn't even know it. In fact, as we will see, that is always present, and our intellect is indirectly drawing upon it all the time to function. So if there is any dependence, it is that the intellect needs that as a subliminal influence in order to be able to do what it does. But this power of direct and divine knowledge is not dependent on the intellect. Our starting error would be to think that our intellect is all or is the beginning of all, without which nothing could be known. Whenever we speak of knowledge, we always think in terms of intellect knowing, or any knowledge through intellect. By habit, therefore, when something of a higher knowledge comes into us, like an intuition, as it begins to form in us, the intellect quickly jumps to catch, because I must understand. So in the act of trying to catch and understand, we have stopped it, but also reduced or distorted it. So be conscious that there is something greater, which has a far greater knowing. It is entirely independent of the intellect in its working. And if you really want to get that, as a first step, you might need to actually quiet the intellect. This is one of the reasons why sometimes, not always, you will see people who are not very intellectually developed, sages and saints, I mean, not ordinary people, being able to access or express deep spiritual knowledge, philosophy, and even with great clarity and precision of logic and intelligence. And yet on the surface, you do not see a formal development of the intellect. Of course, one of the greatest such examples is Ramakrishna Paramahansa, to whom the greatest scholars would go to ask technical philosophical questions, and he would give very simple, direct, obvious responses that in their simplicity would reveal more clearly and directly than any mental gymnastics. And this is possible because there is this working of the higher consciousness directly, bypassing the intellect. Of course, for our purpose, we want the intellect to develop. In fact, that's the goal in evolution itself. And through the intellect to open to this higher consciousness, so that it may use a developed, rich, complex, capable intellect as a power of articulation and expression, etc. So the intellect, we have to think our intelligence as something to be trained and perfected to be an effective instrument for a greater power of knowing. The intellect is not meant to be an instrument of knowledge. It's meant to be an instrument for expression of a knowledge. And the true instrument of knowledge is above. And that's what we are looking at now. But unfortunately, because we do not have access to that yet in our evolution, we have to use the intellect also for gaining knowledge, for which it's not designed, it's not meant to be. And the result is our capacity to gain knowledge is flawed significantly, and we will see reasons why. Nevertheless, whatever little we do know, and partially wrongly sometimes we do know, we are able to argue out and explain with great detail if the intellect is well developed in order to justify it. So, by jnana is meant the power of direct and divine knowledge, which works independently of the intellect and senses. So when it wants to know, it doesn't even need the senses. You want to know something about the sun. You do not need to create a telescope to be able to observe the sun in order to gain knowledge. It can directly engage with, seize upon, become one with the sun and know everything it needs to. It is not dependent on senses. This is another feature which to our physical process of mind seems surprising. But it's not so surprising if you think in a more abstract way. Our intellect needs physical senses when it wants to focus on a physical object. But having made a series of observations on the object, the processing of the observations is done independently of the senses. The pure realm of reason, logic, and mental perception. So if you replace the physical senses by a direct contact in the mind's consciousness with the thing itself, you can see why physical sensory contact is not so important. And this can be done even in a state of normal remote viewing, as done in the militaries, without any special higher grade of consciousness or intuitive development. So this part is not surprising that a higher kind of knowledge would not be dependent on the senses, but it's independent of intellect also. Or it uses them only as subordinate assistants. As an assistant, what do you do to an assistant? What you can already do, you delegate for some specific reason, and the assistant does. So as an assistant, it gives you an assistance. You reach out, oh yeah, this you want to know more about, you dwell on it. And with your sight, you gaze and touch. With your consciousness, you seize and know. So you may use these, even the intellect, for that purpose, both to know as well as to express, but as a subordinate assistant. It, jnana, it perceives the things that are hidden from the ordinary man, helps us to seize seeing the world in the terms of our sense experience, and enables us to become sensitive to the great unseen forces, powers, impulses, and tendencies which stand behind our material life and determine and govern it. So our material life, we tend to know and appreciate only in terms of what materially we can see and observe. The reality is that behind are great unseen forces, powers, impulses, tendencies. They not only govern, they determine everything that happens in the material world. But this consciousness of jnana is able to see and know all that. And it enables us to become sensitive to all this, frees us from the dependence on the sense experience. How far does this go? To jnana, the whole machinery of the world reveals itself in its hidden principles. So what's the world made of? What is the machinery of the world? If you went behind the scenes, there is the story of Wizard of Oz. This great and powerful Oz who is able to say things, command things magically, etc. And what's behind this fantasy figure? And as you know in the story, there's a man hidden with a microphone and an amplifier. That's the secret behind. It's a little thing and the whole front is a deception. In a reverse sense, this is true of the world. The front is a deception in a way because it conceals. But what is behind is in the reverse. It is massive. If you could say 1,000,000 times more powerful, complex, detailed, deep, full, 1,000,000 would be too small. In fact, in practice, it is an infinity. All finite appearance conceals infinity behind. What does that even mean to our mental consciousness is beyond reach. But whatever you can glimpse of it, there's an infinity behind. And in that infinity, you see the machinery. And if you had to describe that machinery, what are the primary mechanisms or components of the machinery? The moment you say there's a machinery, you should be able to say machinery consists of this and this and this, right? Otherwise, you can't say, oh, it's just a complex series of cogwheels. Then you'll still say complex cogwheels. What is the nature of the machinery? What are its primary constituents? And Sri Aurobindo lists them. It's one of the most interesting texts. Very brief summary form. That's why I said it's a bit inaccessible because it is not elaborated upon. To jnana, the whole machinery of the world reveals itself in its hidden principles. What are these principles? The nature of Purusha, consciousness, essential consciousness that supports and holds everything. The workings of Prakriti, the formative power, energy of nature, which expresses, articulates, organizes what consciousness sees or directs. The principles of our being. He doesn't elaborate what those are. God's purpose in his world workings. So even if you have all this machinery, well, what is it meant for? What is it made for? Or what's the intention which works through it? And that you're able to see God's purpose in his world workings. This is how you appreciate Sri Aurobindo when he describes in his sweep of the historical process of human development in the ideal of human unity or the human cycle. Every now and then he will tell you things like, behind this, nature's intention was such and such. How does he know that? How does he see that? Because that is obvious, evident in the consciousness of jnana. What is intended? What's the attempt being made by this gigantic, massive, infinite consciousness? And nature, capital N in this case, obviously, is the power of God working. So the intent behind. And then, so that was God's purpose in his workings. The harmony of his gunas, his qualities. And then with a dash, Brahman, Ishvara, Atman. Brahman is the totality of oneness. Ishvara is the lordship of the divine personality. Atman is the aspect of self where you are subjectively perceived. So there are three poises, one could say, of the divine consciousness. Man and beast and object, idea and name and form, reality and relation, all these. So he's put a list of all these and their workings and their harmony. All these show themselves to the eye that God has illuminated with the sun of his knowledge. So this state of consciousness, jnana, is the illumination by the divine sun of knowledge, revealing everything. Now, the moment you find a wording like this, you'll say, oh, Sri Aurobindo was a poet. He has a way of poetic expression. No, it's not. Certainly he was a poet. Certainly this expression has a poetic character, but precisely it has a poetic character because it describes a reality so complete that if you had to give a verbal description, it would take paragraphs or pages. And you do find him doing that. But much more easily captured in an image because the image is so potent. And that's the power of poetry. And that is why poetry is meant to be, intended to be a means for expressing mystical experiences. Any lesser use of it is at best entertainment. It's not its true purpose. So all these show themselves to the eye, your consciousness perceiving, that God, the one, the divine whole, has illuminated with the sun of his knowledge. So this whole sun and knowledge is a reality of the nature of the supramental consciousness. It is substantially, and the experiences like the sun, substantially, fully luminous, a light, dense substance, which knows everything of itself and all that is, because all is within it. And this is like the sun, intensity, and even substantially. And the light of it, the intensity of it, reveals everything entirely, fully. Nothing is hidden, no shadow. And obviously the image then, vocabulary for us would be to describe it as a sun of knowledge. On the material plane, the sun dawning lights up. So we can say, yes, it's a metaphor. No, yes, could be a metaphor on this in a superficial way. But from a Vedic and a spiritual perspective, in fact, the sun and the luminosity of the sun lighting up the landscape of the earth, etc., is a physical representation symbolically of the reality of those worlds. So yes, it is a metaphor, but metaphor is a limited way of seeing. It is the representation of a higher truth in material circumstance. And as a result, and this is the beauty of the Vedic vision, it sees continuity from that world to this world, and the sun itself is symbolizing, representing that thing. And as a representative and as a symbol, it carries something of that, of course, in a lesser material substance. Nevertheless, you feel the spiritual character of what is behind the physical sun. And so this is the reason why in all the ancient traditions, or to all mystical experience, the sun is not merely just a ball of gas which has nuclear processes that give off light. There's a consciousness behind, and the consciousness is something of a truth consciousness. So you see, in a text like this, if you just read it rapidly, a lot of big words, and it becomes opaque. You're not too sure what he's saying. He has a long list of things. All this is revealed to you. The whole machinery of the world is revealed. Great. But if you go a little bit deeper, you see why he has used all these terms, what is behind it. And all of this you appreciate when we read his more detailed elaborations of these realities. So we will continue with the text. So this jnana, direct and divine knowledge, is of three kinds. Jnana of thought, jnana of experience, realization, or pratibodha, Sanskrit terms, and jnana of action, or satya dharma. Thought, experience, action. Three kinds. We skip the Sanskrit terms for those who may not be comfortable with them. But when you dwell on the Sanskrit terms, there's a kind of a further elaboration, which is why Sri Aurobindo leaves those terms in place. Knowledge, jnana of action, or satya dharma. If you just play with that and the etymology, satya as the truth, dharma as the containing, upholding, truth held, contained, expressed in action. And so you have a very distinct sense and more complete than the English word would convey. So that's why the Sanskrit term there. So, and the jnana of thought itself, of these three, thought, experience, and action. Now we look at the jnana of thought itself has three powers. Then we'll come to the other two things. So jnana of thought consists of three powers: drishti, that is revelation or swayam prakasha; shruti, inspiration; and third, smriti, which itself consists of intuition and viveka, discrimination. So you see a pretty complex structure. You have three kinds of jnana. Of the first of them, there are three powers. Of the third of them, there are two facets. If you look at it like that as a structure, you might get a bit confused, but if you stay in the nature of the experience, you'll find it's very simple and quite obvious. I will use the Sanskrit terms a few times and then begin to skip them more and more when the relevance is no more necessary. But I will elaborate on them so you can appreciate what he's conveying by using the term. So the jnana of thought has three powers: revelation, inspiration, and intuition with discrimination. That's really the three terms in English. The first one, revelation, he has used Sanskrit word drishti. Drishti means sight. Second word he has used in Sanskrit, swayam prakasha. Prakasha is luminosity, illumination, and swayam is of self, of itself. So swayam prakasha you could translate as self-luminous. Self-aware, when you think of I'm conscious that I'm conscious. That's self-aware. But when there is vision, and in vision, in oneness you experience, it is self-luminous revelation. You are revealing yourself to your own luminosity. The luminosity reveals its own character fully. So you feel the sense of what this means, that in this consciousness, in this working of the vision, everything is known, including its own working. Contrast this with the nature of the human mind. When your mind knows something, you don't know how you know it. You don't know how your mind is capable of knowing, how it contains or stores the knowledge. To understand your mind's working, you can only partially observe, but beyond a point, you cannot know what it's doing. You don't even know how you're able to observe yourself. What is this unusual character? So what you do is you watch other people's minds working and then make some general statements to understand yourself. This is one of the inherent limitations of mind, because it cannot know itself and it cannot know how it knows the other. It will never know the other because the other is separate from it. Whereas this drishti is a revelation which is self-aware, luminous to itself, revealing itself. And what it knows is itself. So in the knowledge, there is an identity with the thing, and it is aware of itself in its own way, luminously, fully. That's the sense of the drishti here. So it's a vision seeing, it's not a thought process seeing. But that seeing is self-illumining. This is the first power. So this is called revelation. You see, the Sanskrit word, the English word revelation does not convey any of this. That's why the Sanskrit word is useful. If you see revelation, the statue was covered up and then they removed the covering and it was revealed that whatever. Revelation is more simply limited in the English language to the sense of something covered and then revealed. The secret which was hidden was revealed. But the sense of Swayam Prakasha, explaining this changes everything. And it's a more true way of describing the way the true power of revelation works. So you'll find often Sri Aurobindo will use capital R in the revelation to distinguish it from the common use of that term. Or he builds the context, explains it, and then freely uses the term without capitalization. So this is the first power of the jnana of thought. The next is shruti, inspiration. Again, inspiration in the English word, even if you go back to its Latin root etymology, does not convey the same thing. So respire, inspire, inspire, the breathing, drawing in or flowing in is the best you can get with inspiration. But shruti in the common use of the Sanskrit word is a listening, hearing. So you have more appropriately the description of this as something that is heard in its reception, but has the character of a vibrational quality in the hearing, which reveals, particularly it has the characteristics of rhythms, formulation in word, sound, as an inspiration of poetry and so on. It is more distinct in the way a flow gives form to what comes through. So that is inspiration, shruti. And the third is intuition, for which the Sanskrit word he uses is smriti. Smriti in the Sanskrit common use is remembrance. And I don't know the etymology, I cannot say more about it, but it consists of two sub-powers, intuition, and he uses the word viveka, which we can translate as discrimination. So intuition, unlike the revelation, which is like a seeing, inspiration, which is like a hearing, the intuition is like a touching. And in the touching, or with the touching, is the second aspect of it, which is discriminating. As you touch, you feel, here there is something, here there is not. Or here there is something, and it has a boundary, it has a limit, it stops here, it does not go further. So the discrimination separates the truth from the mixture, is able to distinguish the grades, character, and substantiality of what is true, separating from what is different in substance, but in the touch, in the contact of consciousness. Now, again, the reference to seeing, hearing, or touching is a kind of a reduction to the human experience. In reality, the way it works, and we can draw on examples which are accessible to our mind as it is, when you think of something, you're trying to understand something, at first it feels like it's opaque. Let's say a text like this, which perhaps the first time you read, I don't know what it is. I know what the words mean, but I don't know what he's talking about. And then you read it again and again, and at some point, suddenly something clicks and you feel, I think I'm beginning to get the hang of it. It's like I can feel what it is. It feels so deep. It feels so rich. You're describing in contact, a first and partial contact. And then as you go deeper into it, there is a flow and a rhythm that you're able to feel. Oh, there's a development from this angle to that angle of perspective, of thought, of ideas, and you're feeling a certain flow of things. As you continue to dwell on it further, as if the whole thing, when it is completely held in your consciousness, oh, now I can see, I can know, it's revealed. The whole thing is revealed. You see the stages, and it's in consciousness terms, not in human sensory terms. Touching, feeling, holding, as if in your consciousness, even if it's in the mind, and then feeling the flow and unfoldment and the rhythm of it, and then going further into the full revelation of it, where it's now, yes, now I see it all. I have understood. I have encompassed, embraced, held in myself, become one with it. So in the way the intuitive knowledge works, there is always this full identification, but the degrees of identification make for this. And the vocabulary of touch, sight, and touch, hearing, and sight is a representation in the biological working of the truth of the way the intuitive knowledge works. So I don't know if I can, it makes sense to elaborate on this. Think of it this way. When you touch, what's really happening? There are sensations in the nervous system linked to specialized cells of the nerves, which respond to specialized kinds of things. So some cells which respond to pressure, some which respond to movement. There's one particular cell pattern, it seems interestingly, which responds only when you touch in a particular way, which is a caress of between 3 to 5 centimeters per second. Like when you caress a child. You caress someone to express affection. You go at that speed. And there's a whole bunch of cells of the nervous system which respond only to that. You go faster, they don't respond. You go slower, they don't respond. You press, you push, you bend, twist, they don't respond. Specialized cells which pick up a pattern. And what is interesting, so they did this experiment. They invited a large number of mothers with their babies, and they put these cameras to watch them. And they were told, oh, by the way, there's a delay. Will you just sit and wait? And they were made to wait for a long time. And then they had the video cameras recording. After a point, when the mothers wanted to soothe their babies, they would swing them and then they would caress them. And all the caressing measured by all the mothers was between this range, exactly the range which triggers those cells of the nervous system. We're quite surprised how finely tuned both things are, the biology design as well as your human instinct to convey using that which is the receptive base built up within the biology. But I'm digressing slightly. When you touch, what's happening is there's a pattern of all these cells, specialized cells, which send out signals. They go to your brain, and the brain is processing. That's all we are taught, right? When you listen through your hearing, again, what happens? The sound vibrations entering, they go through a kind of a spiral-like tube, which has fine hair sensors for various stages of the resonances within that tube. And they are vibrating and triggering nerve cells, which all go to the brain and are processed. Technically speaking, the touch on the skin and the hearing inside the ear, where the sound is basically touching these sensory fibers, is touch finally, is finally reduced to signals of specialized nerve cells. They go to the brain processing centers, which might be slightly different, but the signals coming in are electrical signals and patterns of signals, and what is processing are brain cells processing and of the same kind of brain cells. Come to the sight. The light strikes your surface of the skin inside the eyeball, and the skin sends off specific, the cells, specialized cells send off specific electrical signals. They go again as electrical signals, slightly different patterns, again to a group of cells specialized for this, but they're same kinds of cells. So what makes for the experience of sight, which is so different from hearing, which is so different from touch? Because finally, they are all electrical signals coming into your brain, isn't it? What makes for this so different experience? Because sight is not as if you're touching light. It's not as if you're hearing light. When you listen, it's not as if you're seeing the sound, isn't it? Or if you touch, you don't hear sound or vision. They're different functions altogether in the way knowledge is acquired. Where is this distinction taking place? Not in the biology, not in the brain, it is taking place in the mind. The mind which is drawing from through the brain this pattern and then converting into the mind experience of sight, hearing, and touch. So the distinction of sight, hearing, and touch are actually essentially distinctions in consciousness experience, not of distinctions of biology inherently. So there are people in whom this connection gets mixed up, and they have literally this experience that they see sound, they hear colors, and they touch. Touch triggers sight, sight triggers touch sensations. To some extent, all of us have this. There is a kind of a blending of these senses, which takes place because the mind is the same into which they go. So you look at a cloud and you stare at it and you say, oh, it feels so soft, isn't it? You look at an object at a distance, not necessarily that you're able to touch, but you're able to feel. Does it feel heavy, light? Of course, these can be imitated. To create an image of heaviness, you create dark colors. To create an image of lightness, you put fine colors, light colors. So there is a way you can hack this. But nevertheless, if you observe carefully anything, it gives you not just a visual sense, but a tangibility in the perception. And even sometimes an audio sound-like feel of it. Some are fit by association, some in the nature of the perception, in the touch. Even when you speak of somebody, oh, this person is such a light, airy feel. That person has such a heavy, dark atmosphere. You're perceiving things and then interpreting through the vocabulary of these three senses, which are really three modes of the mind's perception in knowledge. So we're coming to a deep truth that the drishti, shriti, and smriti, the three operations of revelation, inspiration, intuition, are really operations of consciousness, and your physical sensory working is a representation of that distinction here. That's why you have sight, hearing, and touch as different experiences. What is the difference in the grade of consciousness? As we discussed already, the degree first of touch, and then catching the sense of flow and rhythm, and then fully revealing and in the vision. So he gives you in the sequence, in the reverse sequence, revelation as the full power, inspiration as the flowing character, the way it unfolds what it knows, what it is, and then the intuitional as the contact, touch, through which you feel the thing itself. With intuition, in Smriti is a secondary facet complementing it, viveka, which would translate as discrimination, separating distinctions. So the moment you know something, you feel something, you touch something, you make out what it is, how far it goes, where it does not, or where it changes. So you take a piece of paper, you slide your finger over it. Oh, now it's more rough. Now it's smooth. But in the contact of intuition, you feel the rough and the smooth directly, and you distinguish from one from the other. So this discriminating faculty, more than anything else, distinguishes what is true and what is mixed or untrue. But even in what is true, it distinguishes characteristics and qualities and distinctions. So again, the power of the intelligence in us to, when your intelligence works, it has two faculties, analytic and synthetic. So synthesis, it takes and joins. Analysis, it splits and divides into finer components. And in the Smriti, these two facets are the root of these two functionings. So in the intuition, you touch and you hold the whole thing, you feel the whole. That's the root of the synthetic working of the intellect. And the viveka, the discrimination which distinguishes even in what you hold, is the root of the analytic faculty. So you see how your inferior sensory mind operations are all reflections of something which is held in a higher grade of consciousness. And over there has a natural characteristic value, facet of working, let's say, of that consciousness. So this is as far as the Sanskrit terms. So jnana of thought has these three powers. Then you have jnana of experience and jnana of action. Now he'll elaborate on each of these things, including the sub faculties of the jnana of thought, drishti, shruti, and smriti. We'll read each of these rapidly. And I expect to have a couple of sessions more to then go in depth in the elaboration Sri Aurobindo gives. Those are absolutely mind-blowing. And when we go through those, you will be thrilled. That's all I'll say. So drishti, sight. Drishti is the faculty by which the ancient rishis saw the truth of Veda. The direct vision of the truth, without the need of observation of the object, reasoning, evidence, imagination, memory, or any other of the faculties of the intellect. You see, the intellect has all these faculties. You need to observe an object. You have the reasoning, you have the evidence, imagination, memory, and others, by which the intellect basically acquires knowledge. But without any of this, can you know something? And that's the direct vision of the truth. That's how the rishis saw the truth of Veda. What is truth of Veda? It's as if he's saying Veda exists and you see the truth of it. So there's a knowledge which is there and you're seeing that and then you're articulating. That's how the rishis did it. Drishti. That's why you will see in the translation in language, human language, often those who have this capacity, they are described as seers. Of course, seer, we generally understand in terms of they can see the future. But the true sense of seer, as it is in the Sanskrit term, kavi is one who has the vision, who sees. The true sense of it is this, who sees knowledge, not just seeing future, which may be a secondary or tertiary aspect of the seeing of knowledge. Remember last time when we read on the Trikala Drishti, this same power and faculty of jnana, when it turns to specifics of events, that becomes Trikala Drishti. So it underlying is a greater power, much greater. So be careful not to consider anyone who has ability to perceive the future as seeing that. This is a very derived and secondary capacity, even if it is true. That is a much more complete capacity. When you have that, then this is naturally evident also. So it is as when a man sees an object and knows what it is, even if sometimes he cannot put a name on it. Interesting. You look at something, you know what it is. You don't have a name for it. As babies, this is our starting point. We don't know the words in the language, in the family environment where we are born. You look at something, you know what it is somehow. How do you describe it? You don't have words. I know. And that's the one of the reasons why we as adults have the impression that they are not so intelligent or they don't understand. They see things they understand immediately, but they don't have words to articulate. And when a child begins to articulate and can articulate in clear terms, they say, oh yeah, this fellow is unusually intelligent. But the perception behind was common to many, not all. There are gradations of development. But when you articulate, then it becomes amazing. And of course, that represents also an accelerated development in the power to describe and express. Nevertheless, you have this knowing. There's an interesting experiment which was done with children when they were shown scenes in 3D or images. This is practically newborn within a few months of birth. I don't remember how many months, maybe it was 6 months or less. I don't know now. I read this 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And they're shown pictures, and they were shown of pictures of things which are normal logically, and then things which are not normal. So on a wall, for example, you would have an object as if hanging in midair. Behind something was hidden, a wire or something by which the whole thing was hung. Or other places, the same object was placed on a stool or with a support. So to the perceiving consciousness, an object which is placed on a support, well, that's normal. You remove the support and the object stays hanging in midair, that's not normal. But a baby who's newborn, theoretically, should not have this distinction. Supposedly, our brain comes with a blank and we are learning at that point. So if you see unusual things, you should be able to say, okay, that's normal. And surprisingly, the baby looking at these abnormal things stared, got upset, and began to cry. They couldn't express what it was. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. What is this weird thing? So there's already a kind of an implicit knowledge of what is true, what is not, what is real, what is unreal, what is possible, what is not possible, etc. And there was a reaction when things were put in this way. So there's a very deep part in us which has this ability to look at things and even sense and know things, but you don't have word to express. So it is as in the drishti, it is as when a man sees an object and knows what it is, even if sometimes he cannot put a name on it. But sometimes you can put a name on it, even though you're seeing it for the first time. How do you know it? That's the nature of here's an analogy. You know it directly. It's not the drishti, but it is as if it's like the experience is like that. He's giving you points of access in our human experience where we can say, yes, that's what it feels like. It is pratyaksha darshana of the satyam. Sanskrit terms. Satyam is the truth and essential, deep, one divine truth of things. Pratyaksha darshana. Darshana is revealing, revelation, vision. Pratyaksha, in form, in substance. I cannot go into the etymology, but it is in form, in substance, vision, in knowing, and knowing of the truth. This is drishti, revelation, the power of revelation. So when Sri Aurobindo grew into this consciousness, all this knowledge and the machinery behind of the world's working, including God's will in the working of behind things, they were obvious to him. From this consciousness, he wrote what he wrote, particularly from 1913-14 onwards, in the Arya at that point in 1914, but even before. But it is from this consciousness that he wrote everything, which is the reason why he can be not only so comprehensive, but at the same time so accurate in nuances of details, and at the same time able to cut through deceptive appearances and go to the thing itself and tell you that's how even the deception occurs in the appearance. Because of this capacity, he could go straight to the root sounds and their etymology explaining and unfolding, and then the rest is how he will articulate and translate to help you to understand and put in logical structure. So when you read his text, for example, on the secret of the Veda, when you start reading, he says, yes, there is this theory, we could accept this part of it, which might be true, but the rest doesn't make sense because of. And so he's taking bits from various kinds of theories, showing what part of it is true, where it goes wrong. And then he brings all these pieces together, and then he says, but there is a deeper truth behind, which gives justification to all these pieces and puts them in their right relation. And he goes to that deeper truth. Why can he do that? Because he already sees from within, and when he sees some theory which is partial or even wrong, he's able to extract the element of it which is true, which gave it the right to exist. But where and how the deception took place is obvious. And then he articulates this. And when he articulates it, when he speaks, writes, it has to have a sequence. You look at 20 things parallelly, and you see it all in one go in right relation with this essence. Now, how would you describe it? There are many ways. One is you start, this is the essence, this is the fundamental from which this derives, from which these facets come. And each of these facets, if you take exclusively and with a bit of a distortion, you get each of these theories. That would be one way. Or you would go the other way. You'd say, this theory has this theory has this is the content, and then build towards the comprehensive. But if you did that, you would have, assuming it's 20 theories, which one would you present first? Which would you present second? Which would you present last? Is there a natural sequence to their unfoldment? Literally all those pieces that he sees in various perspectives, he sees their interrelation, sequences them in a way that has a logical and meaningful unfoldment, each preparing you for the next. And towards the end, the whole thing works out in a kind of a comprehensive blend. I could present the whole story this way, that way, the other way, or a sequence, present this and do a flashback, present the main key elements of the major 3 theories and put the other 17 subservient to them as parenthetical observations. Each way of presenting is to him available just like that. Which one would he choose? That which seems most suited for the target audience of the modern mind. Again, it would be different if that audience was of 100 years ago, or audience of today, or the audience of 1,000 years from now. So where does he target? He has to target it in a way that it builds from what is currently accessible on its edge, on its limit, and builds to what would be relevant for at least a few hundred years, maybe 1,000 years. You see the consciousness from which the articulation can take place because the vision is so complete. And it is this which was the basis of Sri Aurobindo's own writings. That is the drishti. And from here you see the flow of the shruti, the inspiration, and you'll understand now this relationship. Shruti is the faculty by which we perceive, as in a flash, the truth hidden in a form of thought or in an object, presented to our knowledge, or in the word by which the thing is revealed. It is that faculty by which the meaning of the mantra dawns on the mind or on the being of the sadhaka. Although when he first heard it, he did not know its meaning, nor was it explained to him. So if you have ever had an experience of this kind, where something was given to you in the form of a potent mantra, maybe you were told a certain meaning of it. If you take, for example, Gayatri mantra, or Sri Aurobindo's Gayatri, or any of these mantras which has a potency behind, you're told, this word means this, that word means that. And in your mind, you construct the sense. But if you begin then to repeat and dwell in consciousness on it, much more than the repetition in speech, you dwell in consciousness of it as if it starts deepening until the experience behind begins to dawn on you and becomes more and more revealed. And then you say, that's what the mantra is trying to express or is expressing. So the knowledge goes as if through this. It can happen rapidly or slowly. So Shruti is the faculty by which we perceive, as in a flash, the truth hidden in a form of thought. A thought is given. That's a nice thought. Oh my, there's something so much deeper inside. You feel it. Or in an object presented to our knowledge, here's this thing. Oh, it's so interesting. And then suddenly there's a flash of insight. Oh, this will be so useful for so many things like that. I didn't even see that in the beginning. It reveals. Or in the word by which the thing is revealed. So you speak, I've never heard this word before, but I catch what you mean behind it. Interesting. When you think about it, it's not so surprising because all of us have this ability to catch what is behind the word. Often in the way a word is expressed, the feeling behind. If, for example, as babies, we don't even know our maternal language. How do you understand what each word means? No parent is telling you, this word means this. In the context, the meaning of the word is absorbed. When you start speaking, again as a baby, you're using those very words, expressing those very terms in common alignment with the parents' use of those terms, without ever having been taught what those words mean. It's only later on when you start getting into new words, and this ability to sense what is behind from in the context has been disrupted because you have focused too much on word meaning and narrow superficial sense. At that point, a word is given to you and you're taught, look it up in the dictionary. Yes, that's good. It helps you somehow to get sometimes very clear sense of the term. But the vague sense and often a more true sense of its meaning, but also its usage, is had when you hear it repeatedly in the context of the experience and you feel what is behind the word and you absorb it. Strictly speaking, this is the only way to truly learn a language, by entering into the experience of life in the language. So today, fortunately, because of technology, we are able to do something of this through cinema, for example. If you wanted to learn a language, you would listen to and watch experiences, and ideally you would, to save time, you don't have to waste so many hours to learn a small vocabulary. In order to save time, you could make a very rich, compact, and intense series of experiences with words repeated. For children, the same thing is done with images in a book. The cat chased the mouse. You see the pictures, of course, you know. But it's obvious because it's an object. What about complex things like meaning? So and so was upset. What is upset? I've never heard the word before, suppose. But when the person says so and so was upset, in the vibration behind, you feel the sense of it. I remember as a very small child, when my mother would sometimes express a strong opinion regarding something, she was trying to teach us what to avoid and things which are not so nice, stay away from those. And she would say something like, oh, that, gee. Just the gesture and the sound associated with that, you see, a whole meaning of what it feels like to enter in relation with that, or what should be your relation with that, has been transmitted. Did you even use a word? So you get the feeling of how the knowledge is transferred in this, and in the Shruti, in the inspiration, you know the thing and the word and the meaning behind the word, or sometimes you know and the word forms, and so on. So he has given the example of mantra and the meaning of the mantra dawning through the words. It is as when a man hears the name of a thing, and by the name itself, without seeing the thing, comes to know its nature. So someone is narrating, I went to such and such a forest, and in the forest I saw, and he speaks a word, tiger, lion, gorilla. And you catch the word and somehow something is conveyed. We are not taught to pay attention to that. But when you do, you already begin to get a sense of it. And there are examples of people who are autistic. And with what is interesting with autism is there are two kinds of autism. There is a kind of autism where the intellect is somehow subdued and unable to function with anything very useful. Something is blocked. There's another kind of autism, which is where the capacity is very great, but the ability to link to the surface consciousness or articulate or express has been blocked. So inside, the consciousness is inwardly turned and very richly experiencing and even enjoying the world in its own way. And so much so that turning out through the senses to communicate with the people feels so superficial and fake or uncomfortable or overwhelming, and you prefer to withdraw and stay in this world. In the second kind of autism, which is not a deficiency of capacity, but a split between the capacity of perception and the capacity to express. Often the perceptive capacity is unusually developed in an unbalanced way. So there are examples of this, autism, or sometimes they are called savants, children savant or child savant. Little children who do not even have a vocabulary or a capacity to speak, but can express things unusually. So there's an example of one such, which is documented, and I had seen the video at some point. This person is sitting with a lump of clay. You can speak any word of any object. He has never seen, he's never heard that word, and he'll shape the clay to take that form. So if I remember right, in the video I had seen, there was this person saying, "Can you make for us a kangaroo?" This fellow has never heard the word kangaroo. He's never seen a picture or a video. He takes a lump of clay and starts shaping it and builds an exact replica of a kangaroo. You pick a term like one of these dinosaurs or something, pterodactyl, for one of those birds of that age, he will create the shape. How does he know? It's as if some part of his consciousness is tapping into a universal memory or knowledge, and the moment the word is spoken, the thing behind is being revealed, and he has access to the thing behind in its full details. In form, in this case. So you hear the name of a thing, and by the name itself, without seeing the thing, comes to know its nature. A special power of Shruti is the revelation of truth through the right and perfect vak in the thought. So there's a special power where vak is the creative speech that flows from the divine consciousness. The revelation of the truth flows through this, and in thought it forms. And so there is this flowing movement of the truth coming, and it finds form. And then depending on the way the consciousness is developed, you dwell on it, articulate it, or as you articulate, something more comes and you keep articulating it. And that's what makes for the spontaneous poet, or sometimes a musician, or even an artist. So this movement where the higher truth comes and is revealed and can continue to flow in a series of, or in a sequential revelation. And that's really what we would describe as the great geniuses of art of this kind. So Shruti is the dawning, and you see everywhere there's the form and then the thing behind the form, or the truth then revealing itself through form in the thought. Unlike drishti, in which everything is seen and known and in full identity in what is seen. Here there is something which is behind, and then there's a relationship between the two of revelation through a sequence of revelation, of the covering or the symbol of it and the thing behind the truth. The third thing is smriti. This is intuition with discrimination. Smriti is the faculty by which true knowledge hidden in the mind reveals itself to the judgment and is recognized at once as the truth. So something was hidden behind, appears, yes, of course it's obvious. So it's as if it was there inside, you didn't even know it was there, but when it came forward, you realized it was there and you recognize it. That's why smriti, the word means remembrance, memory. So you draw out as if from a memory. He elaborates. It is when a man has forgotten something he knew to be the fact, but remembers it the moment it is mentioned to him. So the way this intuition works and the smriti faculty, as somebody is describing, explaining, narrating, something within you resonates and says, yes, of course, this is obvious. Yes, of course. It's almost as if I had already known it, but when you said it, it became obvious to me. Till then, I had forgotten that I knew it. And then you said something and that didn't make sense. That's not true anymore. It doesn't correspond to something where I already knew it. That's not true. You know what you knew was different. It's not what you just said. So what is interesting in this is you see not only the knowledge which is there, but also the automatic complementing side, the discrimination, where this is not. So when a person has something of this and you narrate a story, you'll see the person responds, and then in the story you switch or shift into an exaggeration and the person suddenly senses it. And you see, okay, there's a shift in the reception or in the enthusiasm of that. But you know it. You know it when the person is telling you the truth. You know it when he's exaggerating. You know when he's lying because of this. So smriti, when you see in these terms used in the Indian context, particularly in the civilizational context, we have the drishti, which is the seeing, revelation, and the corresponding word in Sanskrit is darshana, vision. So when you have darshan, you go to Sri Aurobindo, Dimada, you had a darshan. It is this thing perceiving a great, grand, vast truth experience. It's the same word used, darshana, when there is a school of philosophy. I'm using modern Western terms, they are not correct. But what we call, for example, the philosophy of monism, the philosophy of dualism, the philosophy of qualified monism. I'm speaking the English words. But when you look at these schools, great schools of philosophy, from the modern English standpoint, which is completely wrong and reductionist, we call them schools of philosophy. But in India, they are called darshanas. And darshana is this revelation of a truth. The founder of the school had a vision of the truth and a revelation in that vision, and then he articulated it in terms rational or otherwise. Sometimes they were rational depending on the age. Sometimes they were in some form which were not purely rational, but experiential, transmitting the experience. As in the Veda, which was intuitively articulated according to that age, or at least according to the consciousness of the rishis. So we have this word darshanas, which are what modern times we call schools of philosophy. Unlike in the West, where school of philosophy represents only a group of people who followed a belief. And the belief might have a founder who articulated the belief. The founder may have come to the conclusion purely by logic or by some limited observation, not a vision of a great truth. Or he catches a principle he has caught by a partial vision and then builds around it an entire big structure. But the seed of it was a part of the darshana. The rest was constructed by his intellect. And you can feel that sometimes with a little bit of this intuitive feel. And the great ones are the ones who were able to see and articulate without distortion, without exaggeration, without adding their own constructions around it. So darshana, drishti, is in this revelation. In the Indian tradition, a darshana is highly respected. Even when one darshana conflicts with another, for example, monism and dualism, still within the wise, there is the recognition that the two are based on a valid experience and they represent standpoints in the larger reality. The second word, shruti, is also used for revealed texts and especially for inspired poetry. And the Vedas themselves are described as shruti. because they are articulated in word form, in rhythm form of great truths. And then the third term, smriti, is used for, again, modern understanding is limited. They will say historical information, what is remembered and transmitted in memory. Not quite. Maybe in the later use of the term, even such a use might have been there. But when in India they speak of the smritis of the past, like a Manu Smriti, they represent something of this, an intuitive perception of something felt, known, drawn out in this way. And if you dwell on that, you will often find the underlying truth behind, which was the basis for that articulation. So Smriti is considered inferior to Shruti, and Shruti is, of course, specific to the Veda in this context, but Darshana, Shruti, both could be, they're different. In the Veda, of course, there was the vision of the Darshana, but it's not the word used traditionally for that. You could still say the Vedic rishis had the Darshana, and then it was articulated in the flow of inspiration. The distinctions are secondary. Understand how these words were held with great reverence in the civilizational context. So when you speak of Darshana, Shruti, Smriti, they have a very great value. And in the modern language, because largely our modern education and academia has been westernized and is rooted in Western values, these terms have been reduced. And even their distinction and their deeper spiritual sense has been lost, because there is no equivalent idea in Western academia. In India, if there is a darshana, you begin by assuming there is a great truth behind, whether you understand it or not. This is not acceptable in academia, where you have to argue out and justify. And if I can find in my own limited stupidity 2 words and I show, oh, this does not fit, that fellow is wrong, or I can criticize him as if I know better than him. And that's, from the Indian context, an immature mind, like a child trying to criticize a person of great wisdom because he cannot understand that there is such a deep truth. He is incapable of grasping it. So there's a fundamental difference in approach, and therefore, as a consequence, in the education itself of these things. So you take the Veda, and it is great Smriti and Darshana flowing. I don't understand. It's beyond my capacity, even in my knowledge of Sanskrit, but I will learn it by heart and dwell upon it until the deeper truth behind will dawn in my consciousness. That's how the Vedas were taught, at least up to a certain point. But the mind had been prepared to perceive the truth intuitively behind, and such a mind now could take this, and here's a verse, dwell on it, come back to me, the Rishi says. And then the person comes back and reveals something. This is what I got. And the Rishi says, very good. Now go again, dwell further. And then he comes back with a deeper insight and so on. This kind of teaching would not be understood in the Western context today because of the very coarse-screwed reductionism of the superficial intellect. It is that which is the basis of modern academia, and therefore so greatly flawed. And in India, the whole thing has been imported because there's the imitation, the educational system itself following the phase of colonization of the mind stayed with a colonized mind. What is happening today is a part of the Indian cultural, civilizational consciousness is, having gone through that phase, disengaging from it and trying to introspect to find something deeper and come back and rediscover its roots in its own terms, but without this deeper understanding of what went wrong and what is the correction required. But when it is able to do that, it comes back, and now with a trained mind of the superficial academia, can argue out or compel or assert and play the game. But a very low inferior game. Compared to what used to happen in the older India, I won't even say ancient India, in older India, even 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, a debate meant you spoke from experience, and the other person grasped your experience and countered with their experience, and you grasped on experience level and countered with experience Of course, to the listener, the experience articulation is rationally articulated. But behind is an experience. And the person whose experience is more complete and overwhelms the other, or more true and so overwhelms the other, is the victorious in this debate. But it's not a debate as in the modern times where you pick on a word and play on a word meaning and argue out and by some skill of jugglery of terms counter. It's a debate at the level of not even ideas, but of experience behind ideas. So modern debates in their highest become at best arguments of ideas. As a consequence, you end up always with some kind of a compromise where you say, yes, this is true to this extent, that is true to that extent, and we will agree to disagree because there's nothing more you can do. But when you go beyond to the level of experience, it's much more complete. In some, this may be happening secondarily. But in that mode earlier, it would be that as the primary and the wording was the secondary. So how do you know? Either the viewership itself has to be, the judges have to be of a very high order, or they use sometimes the next secondary symbolic reflection. You wear a garland of flowers, and then as the debate proceeds, the one whose flowers fade is the one who has lost. And the story goes, the flowers fade suddenly when you have spoken either a falsehood or an insufficient or partial truth. And the one who's radiating the truth in the experience, his flowers stay fresh. It will be interesting to see. I've not seen that kind of thing, but you can understand rationally how it could be the base for something like that. So I am highlighting these three terms because Sri Aurobindo has used the Sanskrit word, and it's important to go back to the way these terms were used, their deeper etymological sense, but also their cultural significance and the value, civilizational value that that kind of knowledge had going back at least 7,000 years. You're going back to the Mahabharata, which at least 5,000 years ago. At that time already you had rishis and the greater texts of the Vedas going several thousand years before that. So this is, it's been a bit of an elaboration on this point. We have not yet gone to the intuition proper in the context of the supermind, but why he has used these words and what's behind. This is very important to appreciate. Now Sri Aurobindo uses a more English vocabulary deriving from these three things: intuition and viveka. This is the heading for the paragraph. Intuition is the power which distinguishes the truth and suggests at once the right reasons for its being the truth. Very interesting definition of intuition. Intuition is the power which distinguishes the truth. It separates, distinguish from what is not. So distinguishes the truth and suggests at once the right reasons for its being the truth. So the logical cause or justification of the truth is also held in that knowing. The reasons why this is true. Viveka, the power which makes at once the necessary limitations and distinctions and prevents intellectual error from creeping in on an imperfect truth, from being taken for the whole satyam, the whole truth. So if intuition is this, viveka is this power. It creates limitations. This much is true, the rest is not. Limitations and distinctions separate this part from that. This part is true, that is different or not true. Prevents intellectual error from creeping in. What happens is when you dwell on a truth, because the domain of mind and even knowledge is a continuum finally. When you dwell on it, there are things which are very close to it. And it's easy for them to kind of get associated and stuck with this. This is the reason why you will find religions develop unusual and sometimes ridiculous patterns of behavior. So in that religious practice, tradition, belief, etc., there is this core truth and then there are accretions, things stuck around, which at that point were naturally associated with it because of a certain cultural or historical context. And when that context changes, suddenly you see, what is this tail sticking out from behind this? Doesn't stick, doesn't fit. It needs to be cut out. So this separation prevents intellectual error from creeping in. When by association little things start popping in and trying to join, nah, this is not it. It creates, separates. Or an imperfect truth from being taken for the whole satyam, whole truth. So you've got something, yes, this is true, but it's not the full. The full has something more. This is a facet, an aspect, and it's limited to that. And the viveka, the discrimination, shows you this is it. This is not the whole thing. There's more. And then if you wait quietly, you feel the more is in this direction, and your attention turns, and poof, there's the intuition which says, this. And what is revealed is either completing or it's holding a larger context of which this is a part. But the viveka, the discrimination, prevented you from stopping short with a partial truth. For the whole satyam. He doesn't say for the whole truth. He's speaking of truth earlier and then suddenly he uses satyam. Why? He could have said for the whole truth. There's no whole truth. The truth which is whole is satyam. The moment you catch a truth, it is a partial. The moment you say whole, it has to be the totality, and that the word for that is satyam. So it's a very fine nuance. Sri Aurobindo is not writing it to explain to you. He's writing it as formulation for, as a record of his own yoga and base or insight or the form that he's going to follow in the practice, or what was revealed to him by the master of the yoga. But the nuance and the precision, it's always interesting. Pause and think. When you make a translation of a text like this, inevitably you would replace Satyam by truth, because that's how you've understood Satyam. No, Satyam is the totality. And if you say whole truth, not correct. Whole Satyam is correct. But again, it's a question of context, but appreciate the nuance and the precision here. And the next paragraph is elaborating on this viveka, discrimination. The importance of viveka for the purposes of man's progress in his present stage is supreme. We are at a certain stage where this viveka is the single most important faculty, we might say, in our present evolutionary stage, where the knowledge is going through a crisis. At present, in the greatest men, the powers of vijnana, the spiritual, supramental consciousness knowledge, act not in their own power, place, and nature, but in the intellect, as helpers of the intellect and occasional guides. Now he's seeing the big picture. In the big picture, there is only the divine knowledge. And that divine knowledge is now operating in a substance of an inferior grade of the intellect. In our current evolution, we are in this grade. And that higher knowledge is working in this substance. Okay, so this is the thing you have to hold. At present, in the greatest men, not even in all humanity, in the greatest men, the powers of the vijnana act not in their own power, place, and nature, but in the intellect. What makes a human being great in knowledge is the operation of the higher knowledge in the intellect. That's all there is to it. It's not because you increased your intelligence. It's not because you read a lot. It's because you opened to that higher power. So here's your clue. You want to develop your IQ, you want to develop your knowledge, you want to develop your creativity, you want to develop your power of articulation, expression of truth, not merely your argumentative capacity. Well, open to the higher intuitive consciousness, and that will give you what you're seeking. It's a much more direct, much more rapid way than reading thousands of books and then trying to create a mishmash of things you've read. So, a lot of nuances. The Vijnana act, the powers of Vijnana act not in their own power, place, and nature. Their own power is in their working as they are in the supramental consciousness, in a consciousness of infinity. So when they operate in infinity, that's their own power. Their own place is in a grade of consciousness of infinity and luminosity. In their own nature is in a substance of luminosity and plasticity. They are operating in intellect, which is narrow, finite, a coarser, darker substance. And in the intellect, therefore, as helpers of the intellect and occasional guides, that is their role. So you're working, you're trying to think, you're creating, you're a writer, scientist, whatever it is, artist, and you're trying to do something, and you get a helper, flash, nudge, revelation, push behind the words, intuition, etc. Helpers of the intellect and occasional guides. I'm lost. I've been struggling on this. I'm lost. I don't even know where to go. I've failed in every one of the directions that I explored. And the fellow says, I give up. I think I need a break. I have worked too hard. My mind is tired. I need a break. So he goes for a holiday. And then as he's sitting and watching the waves of the ocean, plop, the whole thing comes. This is so obvious, so simple. He rushes back. You have the Archimedes in his bath. And as he plonks into the water, the thing flashes into him. Eureka! He jumps and runs. I found it. Or this person who found the benzene structure in chemistry. In a dream, it popped into his consciousness. Who decided to pop it into his consciousness? You could say on one side, he was struggling to know, and so he opened himself. Or in the state when he was most open, it was in the dream, because in his waking state, he was too busy with his own thinking process, which was stuck and bound in a limited and circular argument, not realizing circle was his key. So in the dream, he sees all the molecules in a circle holding hands, and he gets the idea, benzene is a ring. It's not a string. So he wakes up with it. So these things come when either the person is open, ready, receptive with a strong aspiration, or when from above there is a help. Humanity needs this nudge, push, this insight, this development, this discovery, etc. A lot of human development, a very large part of it, is actually pushed from above. And it is through such a process from the higher working, from the higher worlds, reflected or pushing inside the intellect or in the heart or the emotions or in the life energies or even sometimes in the instincts, that things are shaped in human unfolding circumstances. So this is why he says this discrimination, viveka, is for the purpose of man's progress in his present stage. Its importance is supreme. Because in the intellect, you get that. If you don't have the discrimination, all the distortions are possible. If you have this discrimination, you can catch what came and not mix it with other things which are in your intellect. So critically, in the intellect, the discrimination is required so that you can access that higher knowledge or receive when it comes. So he explains this now. Directly, we get an intuition or revelation. The intellect, memory, imagination, logical faculty seize hold of it and begin to disguise it in a garb of mingled truth and error, bringing down the truth to the level of the nature, sanskaras, and preferences of a man, instead of purifying and elevating his nature and judgments to the level of the truth. Untrained. Our education never taught us how to, when receiving an insight or a truth, how to reach out and receive it and rise to it rather than crash it down. We've been taught to operate here. So when something higher pops in the higher range of our consciousness, we grab, bring down to the level where we can manipulate it. It's like a child has been given a toy. So here's a nice electronic gadget, let's say. The child says, wow, this is so interesting. But his current need of development is to sense things with pressure and sensation and look at forms and objects. So first thing he does, he starts dismantling and opening and trying to look at what's inside. The mind was not yet developed enough now to appreciate the abstraction of the grade of that this offered. It's too abstract, too far away. So you bring it down to its grade, break the pieces, join the words and play them. I have shared many times this example of some people have seen, some of them very famous, so names necessarily have to be kept quiet, who read from Sri Aurobindo, were deeply inspired. Then, because they had to be their human, independent person, teacher, great philosopher, or whatever, they took that and then twist, change, add a few things which are characteristic of their nature, sanskaras, and preference. The three words Sri Aurobindo uses. In your nature, in your habitual outlook. Sanskara, one could say, is the habitual outlook, cultural values, priorities which have been instilled into you. And then the preferences, which might be your personal preferences. And so these are the three kinds of distortions he lists. And they take this from Sri Aurobindo, add in those things, embellish it with something of what makes it more distinctive to them, and then present it as a package, as their own. You have quite a few people like that you can see all over. Not just in the Occident, but now equally in India. And it's becoming, for those who are into the business of building a brand, this is the characteristic. Brand building requires distinctive USP, unique selling proposition. What is your selling proposition which is unique to separate it from others? So you have to twist. If there's a great truth, you have to twist and make it something. Too many of them, unfortunately. But why? Because you want to bring it down to this level. If instead you say, wow, this is so beautiful, and you remain very quiet, dwell in it, and you allow it as if it absorbs you into itself, and your consciousness opens and flowers out into what that truth is revealing, and you have this extraordinary perception and vision, and you say, what an extraordinary, heavenly, I could never express this in words, but it's so beautiful, I'm going to stay in this. And when you stay in this long enough, eventually it starts settling down and finds its own rhythm, its own vocabulary, its own rhythm, its own way of articulation and words. And then if you are in that mold, it flows down in a poetic outflow, or in a painting, or in a play expression in music, or just a radiance of whatever form that you're able to express it in, or in work, or in your space, or in your consciousness, if nothing else. Then that great truth has actually come down and infused itself in a lesser substance, but retained its essential character. This is worthwhile. But for this, you have to be trained to stay still and allow yourself to be drawn into its consciousness, its power, its substance. It's actually a different grade of substance, and you have to get familiar to be in a state of substance of consciousness, which is not your narrow grade, coarse mind consciousness. And once you're able, you're familiar, then it's easy, because you're familiar, to stay, hold, or even allow yourself to be absorbed. So he uses this phrase, bringing down truth to the level of the nature and sanskaras and preferences of a man, instead of purifying and elevating his nature and his judgments to the level of the truth. So if you stayed quiet and let this happen, your nature would be lifted up, because it's your substance taken into a higher grade, isn't it? And even your judgments, your preconceptions and ideas, all would be changed. So you have an experience like that, you come back and say, my God, I had all these crazy limiting ideas, and now I have such a different, free, greater perspective. You are changed. Often though, in the first imprint, when it stays, it imprints on the lower, it does not stay too long, because your habitual nature comes back and pushes it out, expels it. But if you can stay quiet and retain, it infuses until it shapes your nature, and then it becomes your new state. So directly when we get an intuition or revelation, these things seize and bring down. What is seizing and bringing down? The intellect, memory, imagination, logical faculty, sees of it. So how, and this is really, you have to go deep. All this Sri Aurobindo elaborates upon in his writings in the Synthesis of Yoga. But we'll just touch upon the ideas. Your intellect, because your intelligence has its tendencies, has its preferences. And the part of the thing which is coming that fits this expectation, you grab that. The rest you can't hold because it's not aligned to you. Or if you try to hold it, you shape it, distort it to fit into the slot or groove of your expectation, your mold of belief, preference, etc. So, intellect, memory. The moment this comes, yes, this reminds me of that. Shloop, I pull my memory and plug in or fit or replace it even by my memory. I have seen some of the most outlandish examples of this. There was a meeting, this was in Delhi. It was organized, some kind of interfaith, and I happened to have been invited. I don't even know how it was done. And there was a group of Buddhists with some Lama and the followers. And then there were several people in different panels. And I think they were part of the organization. So that's how they were there. And many people said things, everybody spoke compassion and usual things which you found common ground and you shared that. And I took the opportunity to go beyond the common ground. And I said Sri Aurobindo's assertion and spoke of the larger things, the evolutionary aspect and the change in consciousness and the manifesting of a divine possibility, all that. I don't remember the details, but that was a broad content. On that side with that group, and I could see there was a certain resistance, but I argued out each of these things with such clarity, you couldn't say, no, that's not true. So then afterwards, one of the women disciples of that Lama came up and she said, it was so good, everything I understood and I appreciated, but there's this one thing which I could not understand. And when I spoke of bringing a spiritual truth and expressing it in the collective consciousness in humanity, that part I couldn't make out. And so I again explained, but found different ways. Then suddenly something clicked into her mind. She said, yes, Sangha. And plop, she absorbed this into her idea of what is Sangha as the community of the believers. And that's it. So the community collective aspect was slotted into the box. And she lost the thing itself, which was being communicated, because she found a piece that fitted her preconception. Then I realized that almost everything else she had similarly slotted out into her belief. And then the head monk came. He had the last say as one of the organizers for this. And then he said, I've heard all these things from all of you who are speakers from Sri Aurobindo's teachings, and I appreciate very much. From what I have understood, Sri Aurobindo says, this world is full of suffering, and we have to find a way to come out of the suffering. And for that, we have to do this, this, this. And he spoke all the things which he normally preaches with his followers of Buddhism. And it was so ridiculous. For him even to say that I have understood this is what Sri Aurobindo is saying, it was so ridiculous. But well, I could see that he had no intellectual training of his own. There are many teachers who are of that kind. They have learned the thing and fixed it so much that it just flows out of them in a very structured, very rigid and narrow framework. There has not been in them, at least, the training of thought or even to question. Although Buddhism itself encourages that, but not everyone who comes to a position of authority has gone through a training for that. So he was one of those. And it was very clear that even if you spoke things which were outside his domain of comprehension or familiarity, he would tend to reduce it to his box. And he actually seemed to believe when he said that. And then I could see with that other disciple, the way she had done this reduction, that probably they had done that. And unconsciously, anything which didn't fit into the box was just filtered out, was not even noticed. It was not understood. So, for example, if you present a series of ideas and there's a person who does not understand half of them, he will retain what he understood and say, you know what, those 3 points were so wonderful. The rest didn't make sense. It didn't resonate or it vanished because he could not grasp. It was something like that. He was so fixed in his box. Just an example of how the reduction can be very dramatic, huge. And it is shocking when you do that from a perspective of somebody who brings down a higher truth. And you see what humanity captures and reduces to. It is so shocking. It is so deeply disappointing. And you can appreciate even the struggle that the mother had after all the effort that she made to help people, when she saw that many were stuck on that kind of very crude basic level. And you can see in some of her later talks expressions of disappointment of this kind. Because she saw they didn't even make the effort to outgrow that. So I digressed a little bit, but trying to give examples of this: intellect, memory, and then imagination. So the moment something is described, and especially if you use a metaphor to describe, the metaphor blows out a whole range of things. So if you say the consciousness, higher consciousness is infinite, straight away you picture, and with your imagination, infinity for you is like opening to space. So you imagine all the stars and galaxies, and you're filled in something which is infinite in essence with a picture. And now with it, I'm imagining all these stars and galaxies. It's so nice. No, you got lost in your imagination. You didn't touch at all the thing which was behind. And this is a common thing you will notice in the human tendency. And then the logical faculty. You have caught this and then straight away started building chains of logic from a little piece. That is not quite it. And they don't align. And then they conflict with something else. It creates. So all of these are tendencies of the mind untrained to be able to stay quiet and open and receive until the full thing sinks and is not plastic enough to allow the full thing to settle and form you. That's why the training for plasticity, the training for stilling of mind, the training for wideness, etc., would be essential if you wanted to receive higher knowledge. Much more so if you want to open to the ability to receive higher knowledge of this kind, or open to higher intuition, inspiration, revelation, etc. If you understand this point, you will see the difference between traditional systems of education versus modern. Modern systems of education form, largely derived in the West. They form you and shape you to fit the cookie cutter shape of a predetermined way of thinking, working, acting, slot you and shape you. The training itself is called in French formation, formation, to give form, to shape. Whereas in the Indian context, the training was to make you break all your limits of habit, make you plastic. Now you see, obviously this has to be the way, for example, if you have to play music on an instrument. And the way it's done is you train your fingers, for example, to play every combinations of notes in every possible sequence. That's the basic training, until your fingers become flexible enough. And then in the training, of course, they impose a fixed pattern. But the correct thing would be, after making flexible, you would open to the intuition. And then create, if necessary, initially grooves of various kinds of variations of music or styles or rhythms. And then you're flexible enough so that when a pure intuition comes, it can find its own rhythm, and your consciousness all the way down to your fingers is able to flow with it. So you see the different mentality in prioritizing the educational objectives if you want to open to higher consciousness. So I'll reread the sentence, you'll appreciate fully now. Directly that we get an intuition or revelation, the intellect, memory, imagination, logical faculty seize hold of it and bring to disguise it with a garb of mingled truth and error. Mingled truth, pieces of truth that you already have, and error. Bringing down truth to the level of the nature. So, bringing down truth to the level of the nature, sanskaras and preferences of a man, instead of purifying and elevating his nature and judgments to the level of the truth. So you're bringing truth, you're bringing error, sometimes you bring your own pieces, but the way you fit, everything becomes a big mess. You must rise instead. Without viveka, discrimination, these powers are as dangerous to man as they are helpful. So if there is the higher intuition that flows in, He's saying it can be as helpful as it is dangerous. The light they give is brighter than the light of the intellect, but the shadow which the intellect creates around them is often murkier than the mist of ignorance which surrounds ordinary intellectual knowledge. Precisely because in the domain of ordinary intellectual knowledge, logic eventually ends up contradicting something which is inherently incompatible. But when something of this kind comes, of a higher type, there's a luminosity. You say, wow, this resonates deeply. But then when you build around it the distortions, you don't realize what distortions are being pulled in. A lot of religious teachings have been built around such things. Many of the New Age movements, some of them very genuine in their origination, inspiration, in a fragment, but the stuff which accrued around it became so perverse sometimes. And then there are also many teachers who had a momentary glimpse, then all the rest that they built around it was unrelated to anyone, a distortion around that, because it suited their need, etc. Very common in any kind of inspired teaching or movement. So he says, because there is a brighter light than the intellect, that part is so attractive. The rest, though, becomes much worse and much darker than purely intellect. What you see in the West, for example, in a strong reaction against any spirituality, is largely rooted in this idea. Here's a rational, materialistic framework, which is reasonably internally self-consistent. You give me something else, you speak of gods, angels, higher worlds, whatever it is, doesn't fit. Fantasy, how can I verify? How can I validate? I could be fully pulled into error because I have no way to validate, so I would rather not enter. So a lot of the resistance comes from the refusal to risk losing something which is reasonably solid and seems true because internally self-consistent. So breaking out of that is also equally hard because nature, of course, throws you in experiences which are not compatible with your logical structure. But you don't know how to integrate that because you would get lost if you were to bring something which questions this. So your brain is source of your thought, very simple, simplifies life. But if you see somebody who has psychic powers, as they call it, and is able to read minds or something, it breaks your brain is creator of thought idea. So you have then to somehow say, all right, inside the brain, there are some quantum processes with electromagnetic waves by which you can pick up. You make up a story about telepathy and then you test and then it doesn't work because it's not electromagnetic. So then you say, okay, it is quantum resonance with, what is that, entanglement, something, you make up a story which you can't validate. Then that becomes speculative and philosophical and not physics or biology or psychology. So it's very messy when you lock yourself into that groove, but in that groove, you protect yourself from making major errors with the new knowledge. So that makes for a very slow transition of awakening. People eventually reject this lesser insufficiency of the truth, of which is materialistic, open to that, and then lose themselves because they were not given the training on how to validate those things by a deeper intuition. So in the West, you see, it's very easy to have these mixed teachers going out and creating big movements and impressing because the gullible ones latch on to what feels like a truth, but cannot distinguish where the mixture has come. The others oppose and stay out. And when the attempt is made, there is nothing in the culture to help you build that bridge. In India, at least in the more traditional families, and I don't say this is now everywhere, it's reducing more and more, people grow up with a certain culturing of sensitivity. That's when something is shared which is true, they feel, yes, this makes sense, this is true. And when there's a mixture, they say, you know what, I don't feel comfortable. And you find distance or you make your attempt to separate out. Now, I have found through frequent contact in various kinds of spaces across in the West, there are many individuals who have this inherently. And so it works for them, but it's not to say that it's not there. It is there everywhere. That's human beings. but it is not there in the culture. It's not there in the values, in the bringing, in the collective culture. That's the difference between India and the West. Thus, men who use these powers ignorantly often stumble much more than those who walk by the clear, though limited light of the intellect. So you have an intuition, you say, oh, this is it, and you go with it, more likely you will stumble than if you go by intellect. Because you've surrounded it with things which are not part of the intuition and you don't know the difference. That's why you need discrimination. When these powers begin to work in us, we must be dhira, sthira, steadfast, firm, and not be led away by our enthusiasm. So the mistake is you rush, oh, I found something. Stay calm, wait, stable, allow it to unfold, allow it to reveal itself. We must give time for the viveka, discrimination, to seize on our thoughts and intuitions, arrange them, separate their intellectual from their vijnanamaya, supramental elements. Vijnanamaya elements, supramental elements. Separate the intellectual from the supra-rational, let's say, elements. Correct their false extensions, false limitations, misappropriations. So you can add or limit falsely. You can misappropriate. You take something which is not properly belonging to this and join. And assign them their right application, right extension, right limitation. So when the intuition comes, there's a right application. You provide the right extension or the right limitation. All this comes from the discrimination, viveka. Make in the image of the Upanishads the vyuha. Vyuha is this spread of harmonious pattern. Literally, it would represent as the marshalling, drawing in alignment, placing in relationship. So, in the image, make in the image of the Upanishads the vyuha, or just marshalling of the rays of the sun of knowledge. Suryasya Rashmaya, quoting from the Sanskrit, from the Upanishad. So, to clarify this analogy, let's say from the higher knowledge, several rays descended. So it was one ray which went this way, one ray which went this way, one ray which went this way. So you had three rays, three insights, or one insight which had three facets. Same. You have to place them in right relation with each other around the one center from which the rays emerge. Even in the intellect, there'd be one thing around which the three things would be facets. If you place them in disjointed way, you would have a distortion and even a significant error based on, even if you didn't add accretions or chop them, or in trying to fit them differently in a wrong way, you would cut and twist something to make them fit. I'm just giving an example. But the idea is, in the unfolding, there's a natural, like a flower, alignment of the facets, or in the vyuha, the rays aligning around this center, marshalling of the rays of the sun of knowledge. And so what happens is the viveka is the power by which this rearrangement takes place and things are put in their right place, wrong extensions removed and right extensions added. So it's a working of the higher discrimination faculty which has to work in you. And by this working, it will make you capable of receiving, and having received, make you capable of expressing in intellectual terms. Then he says, knowledge is not for the hasty mind, but only for the dhira, the steadfast. So you have to be unmoved. When that happens, when the descent happens, you wait in stillness, in the steadfastness until this thing settles in you and the thing gets organized. Or you wait until you are pulled up, and then from the higher station, the whole thing slowly settles and organizes itself and so on. So knowledge is not for the hasty mind, but only for the steadfast, who can sit long accumulating and arranging his store, and does not rush away with fragments like a crow darting off with the first morsel of food on which it can seize. Very interesting metaphor. The crow has this restlessness and fear. So you put a spread, it comes, seizes something and runs away. I got what I wanted. Not seeing there is so much more to get. And that's the tendency of the hasty mind. So the training you see necessary for preparing you for intuition, which we will look at later, which he explains also. First thing is make your mind quiet and remain still and be able to make it quiet and still for as long as you need. If you have this, then when the intuition comes, you're able to hold. But with it comes within all the other parts, faculties of your intellect. And this includes specifically all the things which he listed here. The intellect itself, the imagination, the memory, all these faculties also should be still waiting, made plastic, made conscious, etc., to be ready for this kind of an action. So I'm going to pause here. After this, he has, well, maybe just finish quickly. Realization, he speaks of. So remember, all this was part of the jnana in knowledge. And then there is the jnana also, which is in realization, and jnana, which is in action. And of these, there are two more paragraphs, very briefly stated. So realization or jnana of experience is the perception of things through bhava, state of being. Bhava of being or sat, truth. Realizing the truth of being. Bhava of chit or knowledge. Realizing the truth of thought. Bhava of tapas or force, realizing the truths of force and action. All these are facets of realization. Bhava of love or ananda, realizing the truths of emotion and sensation and bliss. So you see, he describes being, consciousness or knowledge, thought, force, tapas, intensity, force of action, love and ananda in the emotions and sensations, and the bliss. All these, they have to settle in realization from that jnana, from that higher consciousness as it settles. So when it comes into domain of knowledge, we have seen all this, and then it has to come into domain of experience, and these are all the facets of the experience. We won't dwell upon them too much, but you get the idea of what form it can take when the divine knowledge settles in your experience. And the last in action, Satya Dharma, is the carrying out of the jnana in bhava, state, and action. That's all. So with this, we complete the first text, which describes this jnana. And next time we'll take up the other text, which has a more practical orientation, and then go further. Today, I'll let it take a bit of an elaboration to appreciate also the way Sri Aurobindo presents the Sanskrit aspect, the underlying things behind. So we have a broad base upon which the rest could go much faster. I will take a quick look at the chat box to see if anything we can touch on, because we have run out of time. Yes, there are comments of people, CDAMG, who says, and there are those who did this extremely well, people like Tesla and Ramanujan, who could simply close their eyes, see the result, and note it down. Yes, not so simple. It was not just close eyes and see result, but we are broadly in that direction that they perceived. So it was not as if they sat down and in the mental state, close eyes and poof, it comes. They had a capacity to enter in deep states of immersion, which they might not call necessarily spiritual or meditative. But even as an intellectual person, you enter into a state of immersion in which your intellect becomes very still and quiet and opens out to a kind of an intuitive sense or source of the thing. And then out of that, the deeper knowledge begins to emerge, and you are familiar with this process. So you are able to get back to it or access it whenever you need. So Tesla was also a deep thinker, but thinker we like to use by that thought process. In deep thinking, it was a meditative poise in which he went to know the thing in essence and had a perception which would be a vision. So an access to that consciously and or often in combination, a spontaneous inflow when they needed. So when they had a work they were doing and something was not working, they would become very quiet and pop, the thing comes. So if they are very developed, as in the case of these two names, then they're familiar with this capacity and they know how to tap into it by becoming quiet and opening. They may not be able to always explain what they did, but they're able to do this. Others who don't have this, they're not as highly developed. They keep working and then they get tired and then pop, it comes. They don't realize that it happened because they were quiet at that point. So often they spend weeks pushing themselves to extreme tiredness. And when they're exhausted and the mind falls silent from exhaustion, the thing comes. And they say, oh, finally, I got the result of my effort for so many weeks. No, you got the result of the effort of relaxation. The so many weeks of effort was preventing you from getting the result. That's the reality. So, yes. I'll just take one question, which Sparsh says, if intuition is like rays of supermind, how is it commensurate with inspiration and revelation, etc.? At which plane of consciousness do these lie? Are they powers of intuitive mind? So the moment we use this word intuition, it's an English word. It encompasses all these three: drishti, shruti, and smriti. Unfortunately, only the last smriti is translated as intuition and again viveka, discrimination. But when you say just intuition, we mean all three, and they belong to the intuitive plane. So intuitive mind. So there's an intuitive mind which has these 3 or 4 operations. Let's call them 4 because the last 2, Sri Aurobindo puts them together. But later in the synthesis of yoga, he speaks of 4: revelation, inspiration, intuition, and discrimination. He puts them as 4 faculties of the intuitive mind. Of course, the last 2 are closely bound, but in principle, the discrimination operates for all. But if you build the base of this intuition, discrimination together, the other 2 can flow easily. So there's a preparatory stage of the lower 2, and then the higher 2 can come freely, but you could speak of them as 4. So yes, they all belong to the intuitive consciousness or intuitive mind. All of them, though, are also naturally infusing from above into the working of the intellect or other ranges of consciousness, even in the vital consciousness, even in the physical consciousness. So they work because they seep in and operate and create spontaneous knowledge or flashes of knowledge on all these layers. Not only in humans, even in animals. So even in animals, there are spontaneous flashes of equivalent of insight, but the mind is not so developed. The insight becomes a flash of awakening for an impulse to follow or for something to be done, or a brief moment of gaining a certain knowledge. And then it settles and falls back. Maybe we'll explore some of this a little when we take up examples next time in the text that proceeds. For the rest, please keep the questions. I will go through them and incorporate them in the next session. Let's pause on this because we have completed our time and look at the big picture. There is already this faculty which belongs to the higher grade of knowledge, totally independent of your intellect. It has the ability to have all knowledge. It has all the knowledge which your intellect could be seeking. So good, please train your intellect, bring it into its fullness, but at the same time, train it to become a fit vehicle for the higher knowledge of jnana and the vijnana, the supermind. And for the purpose of this direct and divine knowledge, prepare yourself even as you train the intellect, and then train specially how to receive it. And when it comes, let yourself be lifted by it so that it can draw you and accelerate your own upward evolution of consciousness. Each flash of intuition, if so worked upon, becomes an occasion for you to ascend as much as it is for a knowledge to descend. This mutuality is highlighted in the Veda. There is a descent from above, but also the descent can provoke or can assist an ascent. And that's how we help each other with the gods. The gods use or need us as vehicles to manifest, We need them as the means to ascend. So that's the mutuality that is described in the Veda. And let this be our reference for the work that we would want to develop more and more. As we proceed with the text, the further methods and means by which we could further develop this possibility will be discussed. But for now, hold this. Your aspiration turning draws a response. And if you're receptive enough, the response can fill you, lift you, shape you, give you knowledge, power, capacity, and in the experience, even the joy and the love and the bliss of what descends. All this is possible. So let's hold this in our aspiration and purpose of how we want to develop ourselves and the direction in which we want to develop. If not for these luminosities from above, flashes entering, humanity would be totally lost. So know also that from the other side, the consciousness is looking for instruments, wants to work and manifest through you. So as you rise, it also finds a fit vehicle, and the mutuality between the two would make for the accelerated ascent. Let's stay in a quiet aspiration, opening ourselves to the higher divine knowledge, jnana, which goes through intuition all the way to supermind, which is waiting to reveal itself and flow into us. Namaste.